She tried to trade her ring for food until the rancher's son said, "Gold isn't what we need. You are." Desperation drives people to make choices they never thought possible, especially when hunger becomes an unbearable companion. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, wearing the face of compassion rather than commerce. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The dust of Kansas swirled around Mary Johnson's worn boots as she stood outside the general store in Dodge City, her fingers clutching the thin gold band that represented everything she had lost. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the dirt street while passers-by stole glances at her, some curious, others judgmental. At 24, Mary was already a widow, her merchant husband claimed by fever just 6 months prior, leaving her with nothing but memories and this single precious object. She traced the smooth metal with her thumb, remembering the day he had slipped it onto her finger back in Ohio, full of promises about their future in the West. Now, that future had crumbled, leaving her hollow-cheeked and desperate enough to trade her most treasured possession for something as basic as bread. Her stomach cramped painfully, a reminder that she hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. Taking a deep breath, Mary pushed open the door to the general store, the little bell announcing her entrance. The familiar scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods filled her nostrils as she approached the counter where Mr. Brown, the portly storekeeper with perpetually suspicious eyes, was arranging tins of tobacco. "Afternoon," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was wondering if we might make a trade." Mary placed the wedding ring on the counter, the gold catching the light from the dusty window. Mr. Brown barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward her with thick fingers. "Gold don't fill bellies out here, miss. We need strong hands for the harvest, not jewelry." His voice wasn't unkind, just matter-of-fact, the voice of a man who'd seen too many dreams turn to dust in this unforgiving territory. "Please," Mary whispered, hating the desperation in her voice. "It's real gold. My husband—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The storekeeper shook his head. "I'm sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Johnson, but I can't feed my family with trinkets. Folks out here trade in work and goods. That pretty thing won't buy you more than sympathy, and sympathy's in short supply these days." Mary's stomach clenched again, a sharp reminder of her predicament. She reached for the ring, her fingers trembling as she closed them around the band. Her pride was slipping away with each rejected plea, eroded like the Kansas soil in a dust storm. She'd never imagined herself begging, yet here she stood, a woman alone on the frontier, discovering how quickly dignity could be sacrificed when survival was at stake. "Just some bread, cornmeal, anything," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of paper bags and the clink of metal scales. Her words seemed to dissolve in the heavy, silent air of the general store, like morning dew under the Kansas sun. Mr. Brown's eyes, small and calculating behind wire-rimmed spectacles, avoided meeting hers directly. His fingers drummed impatiently on the wooden counter, worn smooth by years of similar transactions. "I told you, ma'am, I can't take jewelry. Not even gold. Winter's coming, and I need goods I can sell, not trinkets I'd have to haul all the way to Topeka to exchange." He pushed the wedding ring back toward her with a stubby finger. Times are hard for everyone. Mary Johnson felt her cheeks burn with shame. 6 months ago, she'd been a merchant's wife with a comfortable home. Now she stood in Dodge City's general store, practically begging. Her stomach clenched painfully, reminding her that pride wouldn't fill it. She reached again for the gold band, her fingers trembling slightly. The bell above the door chimed, sending a shiver of sound through the store. Mary didn't turn, too focused on willing the storekeeper to show her mercy. Sunlight briefly flooded the dusty interior before the door swung shut again, bringing with it the scent of horses and open prairie. "Is there a problem, Brown?" A deep voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. The tone wasn't threatening, but it carried a quiet authority that made the storekeeper straighten his posture. Mary turned slowly, conscious of her worn dress and the visible patches on her sleeves. A tall man stood just inside the doorway, his lean frame blocking much of the light. His skin was sun-browned from long days outdoors, and steady green eyes assessed the situation with a single glance. Michael Smith, the rancher's son. Everyone in Dodge City knew of the Smith family and their sprawling ranch outside town. "No problem, Mr. Smith," Brown replied hastily. "Just explaining our policy on bartering." Michael stepped forward, his boots making solid sounds against the wooden floor. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. His gaze took in Mary's hollow cheeks and the proud set of her shoulders despite her circumstances. There was no pity in his expression, only a quiet understanding that somehow made the situation more bearable. "Mrs. Johnson here was just leaving," Brown added, clearly eager to end the uncomfortable exchange. Michael's eyes flicked to the gold band still resting on the counter, then back to Mary's face. "Perhaps I can be of assistance," he said, his voice carrying no judgment, only the practical tone of someone used to solving problems. "I was just leaving," Mary said, reaching for the ring, her hand trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. The wedding band caught the light streaming through the dusty window, a final glimmer of her former life. She could feel the storekeeper's impatient stare boring into her, waiting for her to accept defeat and move along. Michael Smith's eyes lingered on the gold band, and something in his expression shifted. He nodded slightly, recognizing its significance without her having to explain. The young rancher's sun-weathered face remained impassive, but his green eyes softened. "Brown, give the lady some provisions." "Put it on my account," Michael said, his tone brooking no argument. The storekeeper's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't protest, reaching instead for a cloth sack behind the counter. Mary stared at the tall stranger, confusion washing over her face. "I don't accept charity, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper despite her attempt at firmness. "It's not charity I'm offering," Michael replied, leaning against the counter with casual authority. "My father's ranch needs a cook. Our last one left 3 weeks ago, and we've been surviving on Hank's beans ever since." A slight grimace crossed his features. "The men are about ready to revolt." Mary clutched her ring tighter, suspicion mingling with desperate hope. "A position as a cook?" "Room, board, and fair wages," he confirmed with a nod. "In exchange for honest work. The Harper Ranch is 15 miles outside town. 8 hands, plus my father and me to feed." He gestured toward her wedding band. "Gold isn't what we need around here. You are." She stared at him, shocked and uncertain. The prospect of steady work, of shelter and food, made her lightheaded. Yet pride kept her spine straight as she assessed the offer. "I don't know you, Mr. Smith," she said carefully. "No, you don't," he agreed. "But Mrs. Davis at the boarding house knows my family. You can ask her about us before deciding." He nodded toward the window, indicating the 2-story building across the street. Brown had already begun assembling supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, placing them on the counter between them. The sight of actual food made Mary's empty stomach clench painfully. "Can you cook, Mrs. Johnson?" Michael asked directly. Mary lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, I can cook." "Then you have something more valuable than gold out here," he said simply. "Think on it. The wagon leaves town tomorrow at noon." He tipped his hat and moved toward the door, pausing only to add, "Those provisions are yours either way." Mary stood frozen, watching as Brown continued packing the sack, her wedding ring still clutched in her palm. No longer a desperate bargaining chip, but once again a memory she could keep. Mary's throat closed with emotion, the reality of her circumstances hitting her with brutal force. 6 months ago, she had been the respected wife of a merchant in Ohio, with a comfortable home and regular meals. Now she stood in a dusty general store in Dodge City, her wedding ring clutched in her palm, hunger gnawing at her insides. She had never imagined her life would lead here, from serving tea and fine china to nearly starving on the Kansas prairie. But survival left no room for pride. "I can cook," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael Smith nodded, a quiet understanding in his green eyes. "We'd be grateful if you'd consider the position. The ranch hasn't had proper meals since," he trailed off, and Mary caught the shadow of grief that passed over his sun-browned face. She remembered what Mr. Brown had mentioned earlier about the Smith family's losses. "Brown, pack her whatever she needs for the road," Michael instructed, his tone brooking no argument from the portly storekeeper. "Put it on the ranch account." The shopkeeper hesitated only briefly before gathering supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and dried meat, placing them carefully in a woven basket. Mary watched, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness, her fingers still protectively curled around her gold band. As Brown filled the basket, Michael turned back to Mary, his voice gentling. "When did you last eat a real meal, Mrs. Johnson?" The question, asked without pity, but with genuine concern, nearly undid her. Mary swallowed hard, fighting the trembling in her lips. She couldn't remember. Perhaps 3 days ago? She had been stretching her meager supplies, taking just enough to keep moving. "I manage," she answered, unwilling to admit the full extent of her desperation. Michael's steady gaze told her he understood more than she was saying. He nodded toward the basket Brown was now placing on the counter. "There's enough there to get you through until we reach the ranch. It's about 2 hours by wagon." Mary stared at the provisions, more food than she'd seen in weeks. The reality of what was happening struck her. This stranger was offering her not just a meal, but a purpose, a place to belong. The weight of it made her dizzy with relief and apprehension. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because out here," Michael replied simply, "we all need someone. The ranch needs a cook. You need work." He didn't mention her obvious hunger or desperate circumstances, allowing her to keep her dignity intact. "It seems a fair arrangement to me." Mary bristled at his concern, her back stiffening. "That's not your concern, Mr. Smith," she said, the words coming out sharper than intended. Hunger had shortened her temper, but pride was the one thing she had left that didn't cost anything. Michael Smith's expression remained steady, his green eyes holding no judgment. "It is if you're going to work for us," he countered calmly. "We can't have you fainting into the stew pot on your first day." The hint of humor in his voice softened his words. The portly storekeeper shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, clearly eager for their exchange to conclude. Mary felt the weight of her wedding ring in her palm, the last physical reminder of a life that now seemed like someone else's dream. "The position comes with meals, of course," Michael continued, his tone matter-of-fact. 3 squares a day. But you look like you could use something now." He reached into his pocket and pressed a few coins into Brown's reluctant hand. "See that she gets to the boarding house across the street. Mrs. Davis serves a good noon meal." Brown nodded, pocketing the money with practiced efficiency. "Yes, sir, Mr. Smith." Mary opened her mouth to protest, but her empty stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. The rancher's son pretended not to notice, his attention seemingly caught by something on the shelf behind her. "I don't accept charity," she managed, clutching the gold band tighter. "It's not charity," Michael replied. "Consider it an advance on your wages. You can start tomorrow if the position suits you." He gestured toward the boarding house visible through the dusty window. "Mrs. Davis will tell you straight about working for us. She's known my family for years." Before Mary could respond, he turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back, his expression softening. "Keep your ring, Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. "Out here, we don't trade away our memories. We just carry them differently." The bell above the door jingled as he stepped out into the harsh Kansas sun, leaving Mary standing there, the gold band warm in her palm. She watched through the window as he untied his horse from the hitching post and swung easily into the saddle. Brown cleared his throat. "Boarding house is right across the way, ma'am. Mrs. Davis does serve a fine meal." He hesitated, then added, "The Smiths are good people, hard workers, fair." Mary slipped the ring back into her pocket, feeling its weight against her hip. She nodded once, decision made. food first. Then she would see about this job offer that had appeared when she needed it most. The boarding house stood at the edge of Dodge City's main street, its weathered boards and faded paint telling stories of countless frontier travelers. Inside, the floors were swept clean, and the scent of fresh-baked bread mingled with the tang of wood polish. Mrs. Davis, a sharp-eyed woman with silver-streaked hair and calloused hands, guided Mary Johnson to a small table tucked near the kitchen doorway. "Michael Smith sent you, did he?" Mrs. Davis asked, her voice carrying the warm rasp of someone who'd seen much of life's hardships but hadn't surrendered to them. Good boy, that one, always looking out for folks in need. She poured coffee into a chipped mug without asking. The Harper Ranch has needed a woman's touch since his mother passed last year. That kitchen's been a disaster, I hear. Mary wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, grateful for its comfort. I don't know if I'm what they need, she admitted quietly. Nonsense, the older woman replied, setting down a bowl of beef stew that steamed invitingly. Michael's got good judgment, just like his father. She placed a plate of golden cornbread beside the stew. Eat now. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks. Mary ate slowly, savoring each bite of the simple fare. The tender beef and vegetables awakened her hunger, reminding her body what it felt like to be nourished. With each spoonful, her shoulders relaxed slightly, though her dignity remained fragile as memories of her husband washed over her. How they'd shared meals at their own table, how he'd laughed at her early cooking attempts, how he'd never complained even when fever took his strength. Mrs. Davis busied herself with other tasks, offering Mary the privacy of her emotions. When she returned to refill the coffee, her gaze fell on the gold band Mary was absently turning between her fingers. That's a fine piece, she observed gently. Holds memories, I expect. Mary nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The boarding house keeper settled into the chair opposite, her eyes kind but not pitying. This land's full of folks starting over, dear. Some running from something, others running toward something new. She gestured vaguely toward the vast prairie beyond the window. The lucky ones find what they're looking for, even if it ain't what they thought they needed. Mary slipped the ring back into her pocket, feeling its weight against her hip. And the unlucky ones? Mrs. Davis's smile held the wisdom of decades on the frontier. The unlucky ones keep looking for what they lost instead of seeing what's right in front of them. She stood, patting Mary's shoulder. Rest a bit. Michael will be back for you soon enough. 2 hours later, Mary Johnson stood on the wooden porch of the boarding house, clutching her battered carpet bag, all that remained of her former life. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as she watched the horizon, wondering if the rancher's son would actually return for her. Her stomach, now satisfied with Mrs. Davis's hearty stew, no longer ached with hunger, but anxiety had taken its place. The distant rumble of wheels against dirt announced Michael's arrival before she could spot him. A cloud of dust preceded the wagon as it rattled down the main street of Dodge City. Mary straightened her worn dress and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, determined to appear composed despite her circumstances. Michael Smith handled the team of horses with practiced ease, his movements fluid and confident. He pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down in one smooth motion, his boots raising small puffs of dust as they hit the ground. His green eyes found hers, a hint of warmth visible beneath his weathered features. "You're ready," he observed, reaching for her carpet bag. Mary hesitated before relinquishing her grip on the bag. "Yes, I've said my goodbyes to Mrs. Davis." The boarding house owner appeared in the doorway, nodding approvingly. "You take care of her, Michael. She's got more grit than most who pass through here." He tipped his hat respectfully to the older woman before securing Mary's belongings in the wagon. Offering his hand, he helped her climb onto the wooden seat, his calloused palms steady against hers. "Decided to take a chance on us?" Michael asked, settling beside her and taking up the reins. Mary gripped the edge of the seat as the wagon lurched forward. "Seems I have little choice," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of defiance despite her vulnerable position. Michael shook his head gently, his expression thoughtful. "There's always a choice, Mrs. Johnson. Sometimes one's just better than the rest." The wagon rolled past the general store, where just hours earlier she'd nearly surrendered her wedding ring. Mary's hand instinctively moved to her pocket, feeling the small circle of gold through the fabric. The rancher's son noticed the gesture, but said nothing, allowing her this small privacy. As they left the buildings of Dodge City behind, the vast prairie opened before them, endless and intimidating in its expanse. Mary stole a glance at her companion, this man who had offered her work when she had nothing. His profile was strong against the blue Kansas sky, his attention focused on the road ahead. "How far is the ranch?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "About 2 hours, if the weather holds," he replied, glancing at the clear horizon. "Plenty of time to turn back if you're having second thoughts." Mary straightened her shoulders. "I'm not." As the wagon rolled out of town, Mary Johnson clutched her carpet bag tightly, stealing one last glance at the general store where she had nearly surrendered her wedding ring. The building grew smaller in the distance, a reminder of how close she had come to losing her final connection to the life she once knew. The vast prairie stretched before them, golden grass rippling under the endless sky like an ocean of wheat, a place both beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. The wooden wagon creaked rhythmically as the horses maintained their steady pace. Mary adjusted her worn dress, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. "Your father won't mind you hiring a stranger?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Michael Smith shrugged, his hands confidently handling the reins. "We're all strangers out here until we're not. That's just how the frontier works." His green eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but his voice carried a warmth that contradicted his weathered appearance. The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Mary instinctively grabbed the side to steady herself, her gold band catching the afternoon sunlight. "That ring your husband?" Michael asked gently, noticing how her fingers protectively curled around it. "Fever. 6 months ago," Mary said softly, her throat tightening around the words. The memory of those final days still felt raw, like an open wound that refused to heal. "Thomas was a merchant. We had plans to open our own shop someday." Michael nodded, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss," he answered, letting silence fill the space between them. He didn't press for details or offer empty platitudes, and Mary found herself grateful for his restraint. The prairie wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth. A hawk circled overhead, its wings barely moving as it rode the air currents. Mary watched it, envying its freedom. "The ranch isn't much to look at," Michael finally said, "but it's honest work. The men are rough around the edges, but decent enough." Mary straightened her back, determination replacing her momentary melancholy. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Smith." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "I gathered that much when you stood your ground with Brown. Most folks would have broken down." The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. In the distance, Mary could make out the silhouette of what must be Harper Ranch, still miles away but growing more distinct with each passing minute. Whatever awaited her there, she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her this far. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as Michael Smith and Mary rode in silence across the vast Kansas prairie. The endless golden landscape stretched before them, both beautiful and intimidating in its vastness. Mary's fingers absently traced the outline of her wedding ring in her pocket, that small circle of gold connecting her to a life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing mile. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence between them. "My mother used to say something I've never forgotten," he offered, his voice low against the prairie wind. She'd tell us that the prairie takes everything soft away, but if you're strong enough, it gives you something back, a different kind of softness. Mary considered his words, watching a hawk circle overhead. I'm not sure I have much softness left to lose, she admitted. Everyone does, Michael replied, his green eyes fixed on the horizon. It's just hidden sometimes. The rancher's son handled the reins with practiced ease, his sun-browned hands steady and sure. Mary found herself studying his profile, the determined set of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his bearing. She wondered what losses had shaped him, beyond the mother and brothers he'd mentioned. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, Mary said finally. Michael nodded, a brief smile crossing his features. She understood this land better than anyone, said it was like life itself, harsh but honest. As they traveled, Mary reflected on her journey. 6 months ago, she had been a merchant's wife, with a future mapped out before her. Now she was a widow, her possessions reduced to what fit in a single carpet bag, heading to work for strangers. Yet somehow, she was still moving forward, perhaps growing stronger in ways she couldn't yet recognize. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grassland when Harper Ranch finally appeared in the distance, a cluster of weathered buildings standing defiant against the wild prairie. The main house, barn, and outbuildings formed a rough semicircle. Smoke rising from the chimney. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, built to withstand the elements. Michael slowed the horses as they approached. "Welcome home, Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly. "Such as it is." Mary straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly as she took in what would be her new beginning. The woman she'd been in Dodge City, desperate enough to trade her wedding ring for bread, was already fading away. Who she might become here at Harper Ranch was just beginning to take shape. "Thank you," she replied simply, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning within her. The Harper Ranch main house loomed before Mary Johnson, a sturdy 2-story structure weathered by years of prairie winds. Michael Smith pushed open the heavy oak door, revealing an interior that spoke of neglect since his mother's passing. The parlor furniture sat beneath a thin layer of dust, and the smell of bachelor living hung in the air, a mixture of leather, tobacco, and something burnt. "This way," Michael said, leading her toward the kitchen. When he swung the door open, Mary nearly gasped. Scorched pots littered every surface. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, and the iron stove was caked with months of spilled food. The rancher's son set her carpet bag down gently, a flush of embarrassment coloring his tanned face. "I apologize for the state of things," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We've been making do since Ma passed." Mary surveyed the chaos, mentally cataloging what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. Without a word, she removed her threadbare shawl, rolled up her sleeves, and reached for an apron hanging on a nearby hook. "I've seen worse," she lied, tying the apron strings behind her back. The challenge before her was daunting, but it was work, honest work, that would keep her fed and sheltered. Michael watched her with quiet admiration as she began sorting through the pots, setting aside those beyond saving and stacking those that could be scoured clean. He moved to help, but she shooed him away with surprising authority. "The kitchen is my domain now," Mary said, her voice finding strength she hadn't felt in months. "I'll need to know what supplies we have." He nodded toward a door off the main kitchen. "The larder's through there. Not much to speak of, I'm afraid." Mary peered inside, noting the meager supplies, some flour, beans, salt pork, and coffee. It would do for now. She turned back to find Michael watching her, something like hope in his green eyes. "Your room's through there," he said, gesturing to another small door. "Used to be the pantry, but Pa had it converted when we decided to hire someone. It's not much, but it's private." Mary approached the door cautiously and peered inside. The space was small, but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the prairie. Someone had swept the floor and placed a faded quilt on the bed. Small kindnesses, that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She stepped inside, setting her carpet bag on the bed. The walls were bare, save for a small mirror, the room sparse but serviceable. As she unpacked her few belongings, a brush, a spare dress, a small Bible, and the photograph of her late husband, Mary felt the quiet weight of possibility settle over her. This small room represented more than shelter. It was a beginning. Mary wiped her hands on her skirt, surveying the kitchen that would soon become her domain. "How many will I be cooking for, Mr. Smith?" she asked, mentally calculating what supplies she'd need to feed a ranch crew. Michael Smith set down the heavy water bucket he'd just hauled in from the outdoor pump. Water sloshed over the rim as he placed it near the sink. "8 hands regularly, plus my father and me," he replied, pushing back his hat to reveal a streak of dirt across his forehead. "Sometimes more during roundup season when we bring in extra help." The young rancher grabbed another empty bucket, heading back outside for more water. Mary followed him to the door, watching as he worked the pump handle with practiced efficiency. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, highlighting the vastness of the prairie beyond. "I know it's a lot to ask, starting tomorrow," Michael added, his voice carrying over his shoulder as he returned with the second bucket. "The men rise before dawn, and they'll expect coffee and something substantial to start their day." Mary nodded, determination settling in her eyes. "I'll manage," she said simply. After nearly starving in town, the prospect of work, even hard work, felt like salvation. She rolled up her sleeves and began organizing the kitchen, taking inventory of what was available and what she'd need to request. The pantry held basic staples: flour, sugar, coffee beans, and dried beans. She found a sack of potatoes in the corner, some sprouting eyes, but still usable. A small crock of lard sat on a shelf alongside jars of preserved fruits that looked to be from the previous summer. "Your father keeps a good stock," she observed, mentally planning tomorrow's breakfast. "He tries," Michael replied, leaning against the doorframe. "After Mother died, we all did our best, but none of us has her touch with cooking." A shadow passed over his face, the loss still evident in his expression. Mary tested the stove, adjusting dampers and checking the firebox. "This needs a good cleaning, but it'll do fine," she murmured, more to herself than to Michael. John Smith's voice bellowed from outside, calling for his son. Michael straightened immediately. "That's Pa. I should go." He paused at the door. "Mrs. Johnson, the men work hard. They deserve decent meals." "And they'll get them," Mary promised, already sorting through utensils and pots, determining which were salvageable. "I won't disappoint you." After Michael left, Mary continued her preparations, mentally planning the next day's meals. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt purposeful. This kitchen, this ranch, offered something she desperately needed, not just survival, but the chance to be valued again. Michael paused at the doorway, his lean frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Mrs. Johnson, about what I said in town, gold isn't what we need. You are." His green eyes held a sincerity that made Mary's breath catch. "This ranch runs on work and grit, not pretty things." Mary opened her mouth to respond, but the wooden door banged open with such force it rattled the newly organized pots hanging on the wall. A stream of dusty, weather-beaten men filed into the kitchen, their curious gazes immediately finding her. The scent of horse, sweat, and prairie dust filled the room as they shuffled in, boots scraping against the floorboards. They were a ragged bunch, their faces telling stories of hard work and harder living. A freckle-faced youth who couldn't have been more than 16 stood at the front, his eager eyes darting between Mary and the stove. Behind him loomed a grizzled older man with a face like tanned leather, his silver-streaked beard reaching halfway down his chest. "This is Mrs. Johnson, our new cook," Michael announced, his tone shifting to something more authoritative. "Mind your manners." The declaration hung in the air as the men shuffled their feet, muttering awkward greetings that blended together. The young one, Billy, Mary would later learn, stepped forward with a half-bow that seemed more suited to a dance hall than a ranch kitchen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "it's mighty fine to meet you." Samuel, the grizzled veteran of the group, merely nodded, his weathered eyes assessing her with neither warmth nor hostility, just the careful calculation of a man who'd seen people come and go. Two more hands introduced themselves, brothers by the look of them, followed by a burly fellow whose massive mustache seemed to have a life of its own. Mary noticed how they all glanced at Michael, seeking cues on how to behave around this strange woman who had suddenly appeared in their domain. "Mrs. Johnson will be preparing our meals from now on," Michael continued, his stance protective, though his tone remained casual. "She'll need space to work, so unless you're helping, stay clear of her kitchen during prep times." Mary straightened her back, determined not to appear intimidated. These men might be rough, but they weren't so different from the dock workers her husband had employed. Just men who needed respect and clear boundaries. "I'll have supper ready at 6 sharp," she announced, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Anyone late eats cold food." A moment of silence followed, before Samuel let out a gruff chuckle. "Yes, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. The tension in the room eased, and Mary caught the hint of a smile on Michael's face. Approval, perhaps, or relief. Billy leaned forward with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Ma'am, does this mean no more of Hank's beans?" The young ranch hand's freckles seemed to dance with anticipation at the prospect of better meals. Hank, a burly man with a thick mustache, crossed his arms defensively. "My beans ain't that bad," he protested, though his weathered face betrayed a hint of relief at being relieved of cooking duties. The other ranch hands erupted in good-natured laughter, their camaraderie evident in the way they ribbed their fellow worker. John Smith silenced them with a single stern look. The ranch owner commanded respect without raising his voice, his stoic demeanor a stark contrast to the men's playfulness. "Mrs. Johnson's got work to do," he announced firmly. "Supper's at 6. His tone left no room for argument or further disruption. As the men cleared out, their boots scraping against the wooden floor, Mary turned to Michael. "Is there coffee?" she asked, already mentally planning the morning routine. The kitchen would need to be functioning properly before dawn if she was to feed hungry ranch hands. Michael nodded, his steady green eyes meeting hers. "They'll expect it in the morning, strong enough to stand a spoon in," he added with a slight smile. "I'll show you where everything is." For the next hour, he patiently walked Mary through the kitchen's quirks. The stove that needed extra kindling on the left side, the pump handle that required a specific touch, and the location of staples like flour, sugar, and coffee beans. His knowledge of the space revealed how much he'd had to manage since his mother's passing. "The men like their coffee before sunrise," he explained, showing her the large metal pot his mother had used. "They'll be working hard all day. Food matters here more than most places." Mary listened attentively, her fingers tracing the worn wooden countertop. The kitchen, though neglected, had good bones, solid construction that had weathered years of use. Like her, it had endured and remained functional despite hardship. "I understand," she said softly. As Michael demonstrated how to work the temperamental oven door, Mary found herself studying his hands, strong but gentle, capable of both ranch work and careful instruction. For the first time in months, a small spark of hope kindled within her chest. Perhaps here, among these rough but decent people, she might find more than just survival. When Michael finished his tour of the kitchen, he hesitated at the door. "Any questions before I leave you to it?" Mary straightened her shoulders, determination replacing uncertainty. "No, I'll manage just fine." And for once, she actually believed it. While scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot, Mary ventured a question that had been on her mind. "Your mother taught you about kitchens?" She watched Michael's face carefully, noting how his expression shadowed at the mention of his mother. "Some," he admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "I was the youngest, spent more time in the house than my brothers did." His green eyes seemed to look beyond the kitchen walls, to somewhere distant. They were already riding with Pa when I was still learning to saddle a horse. Michael paused, his voice dropping. The war took them both, just Pa and me now. Mary nodded, understanding loss all too well. The pain was evident in the tight line of his mouth, but so was the resilience in his squared shoulders. She recognized that same determination in herself, the will to continue despite everything taken away. Your mother would be proud of kept things going, she offered, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. She hadn't spoken that way to anyone since her husband's passing. Michael's smile was brief, but genuine. She'd be happier knowing someone proper was finally cooking again. Pa and I had been making do, but he gestured at the scorched pots she'd been scrubbing all afternoon. By sunset, the kitchen was transformed. The wooden counters gleamed, the floor was swept, and the copper pots hung neatly on their hooks. Mary served a simple meal, properly seasoned beans with bacon, golden cornbread still steaming from the oven, and crisp fried salt pork. The scent filled the dining room as the ranch hands filed in, their faces lighting up at the spread. The men ate in near silence, savoring every bite. Billy, the young hand, closed his eyes after his first mouthful, a look of pure bliss crossing his freckled face. Even Samuel, the grizzled veteran cowboy who rarely spoke, nodded appreciatively as he reached for seconds. Mary stood by the stove, watching them eat, a small sense of pride warming her chest. This was something she could do, something valuable she could contribute. When the plates were nearly empty, John Smith set down his fork and looked directly at her. His weathered face, so like his son's but marked by additional decades of prairie sun, softened slightly. "That was a fine meal, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "First one in too long." The other men murmured their agreement, and Mary felt herself stand a little straighter. "Thank you, Mr. Smith," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. In that moment, something shifted. She was no longer just a desperate widow, but a woman with purpose again. After the men had finished their meal, Michael Smith lingered behind while the others filed out to the bunkhouse. Mary was surprised when he rolled up his sleeves and joined her at the wooden sink, taking a dish rag without being asked. "You don't have to help," she said, her hands deep in soapy water. "My mother taught me better than that," he replied, carefully drying each plate with practiced movements. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sounds, the gentle clinking of dishes, and the distant laughter of the ranch hands outside. "You did well tonight," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The men haven't eaten like that in months." Mary glanced at him, noticing how the lamplight softened his sun-weathered features. "You knew nothing about me, except I was desperate enough to trade my wedding ring for bread. That was quite a risk to take." Michael smiled, the corners of his green eyes crinkling. "I saw pride in your bearing, even hungry. People reveal themselves in hard moments. You showed character when most would have shown only desperation." His words warmed something inside her that had been cold since her husband's passing. She finished the last pot and dried her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how comfortable she felt in this kitchen that had been a disaster only yesterday. Michael shifted his weight, suddenly seeming almost boyish, despite his tall frame. From behind his back, he produced a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers, purple coneflowers, and golden black-eyed Susans, tied with a simple piece of twine. "Thought your room might like a little color," he said, offering them with a slight flush to his cheeks. "Ma always liked flowers in the house, said they reminded us there's beauty even in hard places." Mary accepted the bouquet, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. The simple gesture touched her deeply, a crack of gentleness opening inside her hardened heart. "Thank you," she whispered, bringing the flowers to her nose. Their subtle fragrance carried memories of easier times, of gardens and homes with permanent foundations. "It's nothing," Michael said, heading toward the door. He paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the darkening prairie sky. "Rest well, Mrs. Johnson. Tomorrow comes early around here." After he left, Mary stood alone in the kitchen, cradling the wildflowers. For months, she'd focused only on survival, on the next meal, the next shelter. Now, in this unexpected place, someone had seen her as more than just a hungry widow. The rancher's son had seen a person worth flowers, worth kindness. She touched the pocket where her wedding ring rested, a small weight against her hip. Perhaps there was room in her heart for both, the treasured past and whatever uncertain future awaited her at Harper Ranch. That night, Mary placed the flowers on her windowsill, their delicate petals catching the last rays of sunset. She removed her wedding ring, turning it slowly between her fingers before placing it carefully in the pocket of her worn dress. For the first time in months, thoughts of her late husband brought a gentle ache rather than stabbing grief. The memories came softer now. His laugh, the way he'd squeeze her hand at night, without the crushing weight that had followed her since the fever took him. The small room that had once been a pantry felt like a sanctuary after so many uncertain nights. Mary traced the rough wooden walls with her fingertips, feeling oddly at peace. She set the mechanical alarm clock for 4 in the morning, knowing the Harper Ranch kitchen would need her early. The work would be hard, but it was hers to do, a purpose when she thought she had none left. Sleep came easier than it had in months, and when the alarm jangled in the darkness, Mary rose without hesitation. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin, pinned her hair neatly, and straightened her apron with practiced hands. The kitchen was silent and cold as she coaxed flames from the temperamental stove, working patiently until the fire caught and held. The rich aroma of coffee soon filled the space as she brewed it strong enough for cowboys who'd face long hours in the saddle. Her hands worked from memory, mixing biscuit dough and rolling it out on the floured surface. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, golden biscuits filled the warming tray, and salt pork sizzled in the cast-iron skillet. The floorboards creaked, announcing an early arrival. Billy, the freckle-faced young ranch hand, stood in the doorway, hat in hand, drawn by the irresistible smells. His eager eyes took in the spread with undisguised longing. Mary turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. A smile, rare and genuine, softened her features as she regarded the youth. "Breakfast at 5 means at 5, not a minute before," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Billy's face broke into a wide grin, anticipation shining in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. Just thought I might help set the table." The excuse was transparent, but Mary appreciated the boy's enthusiasm. "Well then," she conceded, nodding toward the stack of tin plates, "make yourself useful." As Billy arranged the dishes, Mary caught herself humming, a simple tune her mother had sung in their Ohio kitchen years ago. The sound surprised her, this small sign of contentment rising unbidden from somewhere deep inside, where hope had begun to take root again. The men filed in for breakfast, taking their places at the long wooden table. The kitchen smelled of fresh biscuits and strong coffee, a welcome change from the months before Mary's arrival. John Smith, the weathered ranch owner, was already splitting his third biscuit, honey dripping onto his calloused fingers. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked, his usual stoic expression softened by satisfaction. The other hands paused, equally curious about their new cook's background. Mary hesitated, memories of her former life briefly clouding her eyes. "From my mother in Ohio, and then my husband," she finally replied, her voice steady despite the pang of grief that accompanied any mention of her past. "A woman learns what she needs to." Samuel, the grizzled ranch hand, nodded appreciatively. "Well, whatever you learned, it beats Hank's cooking by a country mile." The burly man with the thick mustache feigned offense, but even he couldn't argue with the truth of it. Billy, the freckled youth, shoveled the last of his eggs onto his fork. "Ma'am, these are better than my mama's, and I'd never tell her that." His earnest compliment brought a rare smile to Mary's face as she refilled coffee cups around the table. As the men filed out to begin their day's work, Michael lingered in the doorway. The morning sun caught in his hair as he leaned against the frame, watching Mary clear away the breakfast dishes. "The supply wagon goes to town at week's end," he said, his voice practical but gentle. "Make a list of what you need for the kitchen." He gestured toward a small slate hanging near the pantry door. "Pa had that put up for Mother years ago." Mary nodded, already mentally cataloging the flour, sugar, and spices running low after a week of proper meals. "Thank you, Mr. Smith." "Michael," he corrected softly. His green eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he added, "There's a milk cow in the barn. Rosie, I can show you after supper if you want fresh milk for tomorrow's breakfast." His practicality masked genuine care, something Mary was slowly learning to recognize in the rancher's son. Where other men might have offered empty compliments, Michael offered tools for her success. Information, resources, respect. "I'd appreciate that," Mary replied, turning back to her work. As the door closed behind him, she allowed herself to acknowledge the small warmth blooming in her chest. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something like contentment. She tucked her wedding ring deeper into her pocket and began writing her supply list. Each item a small declaration of her new place in this harsh, beautiful world. As the weeks passed, Mary Johnson found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm at Harper Ranch. Each morning, she rose before dawn, coaxed the temperamental stove to life, and prepared hearty meals that fueled the men through their long days of work. The kitchen had become her domain, a place where she could rebuild her sense of purpose after losing everything. One afternoon, while taking inventory of the pantry supplies, Mary discovered a small, overgrown plot behind the house, a kitchen garden long neglected since Michael's mother had passed. With John's permission, she began clearing the weeds, imagining fresh vegetables to supplement their meals. "My mother would be pleased," John remarked one evening, watching her dirt-stained hands as she served dinner. That garden was her pride. The ranch hands had grown accustomed to her presence, their initial wariness replaced by appreciation for her cooking and quiet strength. Even Samuel, the most grizzled of the crew, would remove his hat before entering her kitchen. 3 days later, as Mary was hanging laundry, she spotted a cloud of dust approaching the ranch. 3 rough-looking men rode into the yard, their clothes travel-worn, their faces hard beneath the prairie sun. They dismounted, asking for work and food. Michael emerged from the barn, sizing them up with a cautious eye. He introduced Mary as the ranch cook, then immediately established boundaries. "Mrs. Johnson keeps this kitchen. Her word is law here," he stated firmly, his stance protective without being obvious. "We can use extra hands for the season if you're willing to work." One of the men, Wade, looked Mary up and down with an unsettling gaze that made her skin crawl. Unlike the other ranch hands who treated her with respect, his eyes held something predatory. "Pretty little thing to be out here all alone," Wade remarked, his smile not reaching his eyes. Mary straightened her back and met his gaze directly. "Those who work, eat," she replied evenly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Those who don't, move on." Billy, who had been watching from the corral, moved closer to the house, his young face serious for once. Later, after showing the new men to the bunkhouse, Michael found Mary in the kitchen, kneading bread with more force than necessary. "Trust your instincts," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "Anyone bothers you, they're gone. No questions asked." The protection in his voice steadied her, a new warmth blooming in her chest. She nodded, flour dusting her hands. "I can handle myself," she assured him, though the support meant more than she could express. "I know you can," Michael replied with a small smile. "That's why you're here." The evening air carried a gentle chill as Michael Smith led Mary across the yard toward the barn. Lantern light cast long shadows as they approached Rosie, the ranch's milk cow, who greeted them with a soft lowing sound. "She's gentle," Michael said, setting down the lantern. "Ma used to say Rosie gave the best milk in Kansas." He demonstrated the technique, his strong hands working with surprising tenderness. "Like this, firm but not rough." Mary watched intently before taking her place on the small stool. Her first attempts sent milk spraying everywhere but the bucket, drawing a rare laugh from Michael. The sound startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard genuine laughter. "My mother taught me when I was 8, he explained, adjusting Mary's grip. "Said every ranch boy should know how to milk, even if the women usually handled it." His voice softened. "After she passed, things changed. Pa tried, but the house lost its heart." Mary nodded, finding her rhythm with the cow. "My mother taught me to cook, but my husband appreciated it most." The memory brought less pain than before. He'd say a good meal made any house a home. Michael leaned against a post, watching her work. That's what Ma believed too. She'd gather wildflowers for the table. Even in winter, she'd find pine branches or dried grasses. He gestured toward the barn door. "That's why I brought you those flowers. Reminded me of her, making something beautiful from what most folks overlook." Rosie shifted, and Mary adjusted her position. "Your father doesn't talk about her much." "Pa keeps his grief close," Michael replied. "Lost 2 sons to the war, then Ma to fever. Some days, words just don't come." The bucket filled slowly as they sat in comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of milk hitting metal creating its own quiet melody. Mary found herself sharing stories of her merchant husband, how they dreamed of prosperity before illness took him. When they finished, Michael took the heavy bucket while Mary carried the lantern. Above them, stars scattered across the vast prairie sky like diamonds on black velvet, more brilliant than any jewelry she'd ever owned. At the kitchen door, Michael paused, his face half illuminated by lantern light. "Mary, I'm glad you're here. We all are." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She looked up, meeting his steady gaze, gratitude mingling with an unfamiliar fear. "I'm beginning to be glad too." The words came out barely above a whisper. As she stepped inside, Mary felt something new taking root inside her. Fragile as a prairie flower, slow as the seasons, but undeniably real. The ring in her pocket was her past. Whatever grew between her and this ranch, these people, was her future. The weeks that followed brought challenge and change. Mary's hands grew calloused from kneading bread and hauling water, her once soft merchant's wife fingers now strong and capable. Her hollow cheeks filled out as she ate regularly at her own table, and the kitchen, once a disaster of scorched pots, became her undisputed domain. Even John Smith, with his gruff manner, nodded approval when passing through. One Tuesday, chaos erupted when Michael was thrown from his horse while checking fence lines. Billy came galloping in, panic in his young eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Michael. He's hurt bad." The kitchen emptied as hands rushed to bring the rancher's son home, his shoulder dislocated and face bloodied. Mary's heart nearly stopped at the sight, but her hands remained steady as she cleaned his wounds, following his pained instructions on setting the shoulder. "You've got healing hands," he whispered that night as she changed his bandages. The tenderness in his green eyes made her flush with feeling she thought had died with her husband. Later came the rustlers, 3 men who thought the ranch vulnerable with Michael injured. They hadn't counted on Mary's vigilance or John's shotgun. She stood on the porch beside the elder Smith, rifle in hand, while Samuel and Hank flanked them. The standoff ended without bloodshed, but the moment cemented Mary's place among them, no longer just a cook, but family. Through harvest season, Mary expanded her role, organizing the kitchen garden into neat rows that yielded more than the ranch had seen in years. Mrs. Davis visited from town, bringing seeds and staying for supper. "You've brought life back to this place," the boarding house owner observed. watching Mary move confidently through the kitchen. Even Wade, initially threatening, found his place hauling water and chopping wood from Mary's stove, his rough edges softened by her firm but fair treatment. "Never thought I'd respect a woman giving orders," he admitted to Billy one evening, "but she's earned it fair." On quiet evenings, Mary and Michael would sit on the porch, watching the sun paint the prairie gold. Sometimes they spoke of their losses, other times of small hopes for tomorrow. Their hands would find each other in the gathering darkness, a silent promise neither rushed to name. But through every trial, Mary found herself less defined by what she'd lost and more by what she'd built. The prairie demanded everything, but in return, it gave her love, purpose, and the kind of belonging gold could never buy. As the sun set over Harper Ranch, Mary Johnson stood in her kitchen, wedding ring safely tucked away in a small box on her shelf. No longer her only treasure, but a memory she could now carry with strength rather than desperation.